Beirut, Lebanon, 1994. A funeral procession winds through narrow streets in the southern suburbs, a neighborhood known as the Dahiyeh. Hundreds of mourners walk behind a flag-draped coffin, chanting prayers and slogans. Women dressed in black weep openly. Men carry photographs of the deceased. A young fighter killed in clashes with Israeli forces near the border. The procession moves slowly, reverently, through streets lined with concrete apartment buildings scarred by decades of civil war. Above, laundry hangs from balconies. Children watch from doorways. Shopkeepers pause their work to observe the passing cortege. This is a community that has buried many of its sons, and funerals have become rituals of grief and defiance, moments when the living honor the dead and renew their commitment to resistance. What no one in that crowd knows is that hidden within the procession are 5 men who do not belong. They wear the same dark clothing as other mourners. They carry the same photographs. They chant the same prayers in perfect Arabic. But they are not Lebanese. They are not Hezbollah supporters. They are Israeli operatives from Mossad's Caesarea unit, and they are not there to mourn. They are there to kill. The target walks 10 meters ahead of them. Imad Mughniyah, 32 years old, Hezbollah's chief of external security operations. The man who planned the bombings of the U.S. Embassy and Marine Barracks in Beirut, killing over 300 people. The man who orchestrated the kidnapping and murder of CIA Station Chief William Buckley, who was tortured for months before his death. The man who masterminded the hijacking of TWA Flight 847, during which U.S. Navy diver Robert Stetham was beaten and shot, his body dumped on the tarmac in Beirut. The man Israel has been hunting for over a decade, who has survived multiple assassination attempts through paranoia, operational security, and an almost supernatural ability to sense danger. But on this day, Mughniyah has made a mistake. He has attended a funeral for one of his operatives, believing the crowd provides safety. He does not know that Israeli intelligence has been tracking this funeral for days, waiting for confirmation that he would appear. He does not know that the 5 mourners behind him have rehearsed this operation for weeks in a mock-up of these exact streets built in a classified facility in the Negev desert. He does not know that beneath their traditional mourning clothes, they carry weapons designed to kill quickly and silently in crowded spaces. The procession turns a corner. The street narrows. Buildings press closer. The crowd compacts, bodies pushed together by the confined space. This is the killing ground Mossad has chosen. In approximately 90 seconds, Imad Mughniyah will be dead. The operation that will unfold has been years in planning, involving surveillance across 3 continents, recruitment of local assets who risked their lives to provide intelligence, and a level of audacity that even veteran Mossad officers considered borderline reckless. Because infiltrating a Hezbollah funeral procession in the heart of their stronghold, surrounded by armed fighters who would shoot suspected Israeli agents on sight, represented a degree of operational danger that few intelligence services would accept. But Israel had concluded that Mughniyah represented a threat significant enough to justify extraordinary risks. His operations had killed hundreds of Israelis, Americans, and others. His networks extended across the Middle East, Europe, and South America. His relationship with Iranian intelligence provided Hezbollah with resources and expertise that made the organization far more dangerous than it would have been otherwise. And most critically, he was planning new operations that Israeli intelligence believed would involve attacks inside Israel itself, potentially using the networks he had built to smuggle operatives and weapons across the border. This is the story of how Mossad transformed a funeral into an execution chamber, how intelligence services exploit cultural rituals that communities trust, how 5 men walked into hostile territory with no escape plan beyond vanishing into chaos, and how one of the world's most wanted terrorists died surrounded by his own people, who never realized that assassins were standing among them until it was too late. Understanding how Mossad killed Imad Mughniyah requires understanding who he was, and how he became the most dangerous man Israel had never captured. Born in 1962 in Beirut's Shiite slums, Mughniyah grew up in poverty and sectarian violence. His father died when he was young, leaving his mother to raise 6 children in a 2-room apartment where water came from a communal tap and electricity functioned sporadically. He watched his older brothers join Palestinian militant groups in the 1970s, learning from childhood that armed resistance was how the weak fought the strong, how the dispossessed challenged those who possessed everything. Lebanon in the 1970s was descending into civil war, a conflict that would last 15 years and kill over 150,000 people. Beirut, once called the Paris of the Middle East, became a patchwork of militia-controlled neighborhoods where crossing invisible boundaries could mean death. Mughniyah's neighborhood was controlled by various Palestinian factions who used Lebanese territory to launch attacks against Israel. Israeli retaliation came in the form of airstrikes, commando raids, and artillery bombardments that killed civilians and fighters indiscriminately, creating cycles of violence that fed on themselves. At 15, Mughniyah joined Force 17, a Palestinian militant group associated with Yasser Arafat's Fatah faction. He was too young to be a fighter, so they used him as a messenger, carrying communications between safe houses and weapons caches. He learned how armed groups operated, how they moved through hostile territory, how they hid from Israeli surveillance, and how they planned operations with limited resources against a vastly superior enemy. He learned to think tactically, to identify vulnerabilities in security systems, to exploit moments of complacency that even professional security forces could not entirely eliminate. His real education came after the 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon, when Israeli forces occupied Beirut and drove the PLO leadership into exile. The invasion was Israel's attempt to destroy Palestinian military infrastructure in Lebanon and install a friendly Christian government that would sign a peace treaty. But the invasion created something Israel had not anticipated. Hezbollah, the Party of God, a Shiite resistance movement backed by Iran that would prove far more dangerous than the Palestinian groups it replaced. Mughniyah joined Hezbollah's military wing in 1983, bringing skills and experience that made him valuable despite his youth. He understood explosives, having learned from Palestinian bomb makers. He understood urban warfare, having fought against Israeli forces during the invasion. And he understood intelligence work, having spent years observing how successful operations were planned and executed. Hezbollah's leadership recognized his potential and sent him to Iran for advanced training with the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which was establishing Hezbollah as its proxy in Lebanon. The training in Iran lasted 6 months and transformed Mughniyah from a street fighter into a professional operative. Iranian instructors, many of whom had been trained by Western intelligence services before the 1979 revolution, taught him surveillance techniques, operational security, interrogation methods, and the art of building networks that could survive penetration by enemy intelligence. They taught him how to compartmentalize operations so that no single arrest could compromise entire networks. They taught him how to use fear as a weapon, how psychological warfare could accomplish objectives that military force could not achieve. And they taught him patience, the understanding that successful operations often required months or years of preparation. When Mughniyah returned to Beirut in late 1983, he immediately applied his training. On April 18, 1983, a suicide truck bomb destroyed the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, killing 63 people, including 17 Americans. The attack was Hezbollah's announcement that American forces supporting the Christian-dominated Lebanese government would pay a price for their intervention. 6 months later, on October 23, 2 more truck bombs struck the U.S. Marine Barracks and the French military headquarters, killing 241 American servicemen and 58 French paratroopers. The attacks were the deadliest single-day loss for the U.S. military since the Vietnam War and forced President Reagan to withdraw American forces from Lebanon within months. Mughniyah planned both operations. He selected the targets, recruited the suicide bombers, built the explosive devices, and coordinated the attacks with precision that shocked Western intelligence agencies. The bombs were massive. Over 12,000 pounds of explosives in each truck. Enough to collapse reinforced concrete buildings. The timing was simultaneous, demonstrating coordination between cells that operated independently until the moment of attack. And the security around the planning was so tight that American and Israeli intelligence had no advance warning despite having extensive surveillance networks in Beirut. The success of these operations established Mughniyah's reputation within Hezbollah and Iranian intelligence. He became the organization's chief of external security operations, responsible for planning attacks against Israeli and Western targets outside Lebanon. He established networks across Europe and South America, recruiting operatives from Lebanese diaspora communities who could travel on Western passports and operate without attracting attention. He built relationships with other militant groups: the Irish Republican Army, various Latin American guerrilla organizations, Palestinian factions, creating a global network that could provide logistical support, weapons, and safe houses. Between 1983 and 1992, Mughniyah orchestrated a campaign of kidnappings, hijackings, and bombings that made him one of the most wanted men in the world. His operatives kidnapped Western hostages in Beirut, including CIA Station Chief William Buckley, who was tortured for information about American intelligence operations in Lebanon. Buckley's torture lasted months. It was recorded on videotapes sent to the CIA. The tapes provided Hezbollah with detailed knowledge of American intelligence networks in the Middle East. His death in captivity was one of the CIA's most humiliating failures, a reminder that even senior intelligence officers were vulnerable when operating in hostile environments. In 1985, Mughniyah planned the hijacking of TWA Flight 847, which departed Athens bound for Rome, carrying 153 passengers and crew. His operatives seized control of the aircraft, forced the pilots to fly to Beirut, and held passengers hostage for 17 days while demanding the release of Shiite prisoners held by Israel. During the hijacking, they beat and murdered Robert Stetham, a U.S. Navy diver, shooting him in the head and dumping his body on the tarmac. The hijacking received worldwide media coverage. Journalists reported live from Beirut airport as negotiations dragged on. Eventually, Israel quietly released the prisoners, and the hijackers disappeared into Beirut's southern suburbs, where Hezbollah controlled territory and could provide protection. Israeli intelligence had been tracking Mughniyah since the 1983 embassy bombing. His file at Mossad headquarters contained hundreds of pages documenting his operations, his networks, his travel patterns, and his security protocols. They knew he rarely spent more than one night in the same location. They knew he never used phones, communicating only through trusted couriers. They knew he employed multiple bodyguards and traveled in convoys of vehicles that changed routes constantly. They knew he had survived at least 3 previous assassination attempts, including a car bomb in 1985 that killed his brother instead when Mughniyah changed vehicles at the last moment. The car bomb had been planted by Mossad operatives who had tracked Mughniyah for weeks. They had identified the vehicle he used most frequently, a white Mercedes sedan that he drove through Beirut's Christian neighborhoods, where he felt relatively safe from Hezbollah's enemies. The bomb was sophisticated, designed to detonate when the car exceeded 40 km per hour, ensuring it would explode in traffic where Mughniyah could not escape. But on the day of the planned assassination, Mughniyah received a warning. Intelligence sources suggest it came from a Syrian intelligence officer who had been bribed by Hezbollah to monitor Israeli activities in Lebanon. The warning was vague, nothing specific, just advice to be careful. But it was enough. Mughniyah gave the Mercedes to his younger brother, Jihad, and took a different vehicle. Jihad Mughniyah died when the bomb detonated on a busy street in West Beirut. The explosion killed 3 other people and wounded a dozen more. Imad Mughniyah attended his brother's funeral but left immediately afterward, understanding that Israeli intelligence would be watching to see if he appeared. The failed assassination taught Mossad 2 critical lessons. First, that Mughniyah had sources within Syrian intelligence who provided warnings about Israeli operations. Second, that he would not be killed through conventional methods like car bombs or sniper attacks, because his security protocols were too sophisticated and his paranoia too deep. If Mossad wanted to eliminate him, they would need to use methods that exploited his few vulnerabilities. And the only vulnerability they had identified was his sense of duty to Hezbollah. He attended funerals, weddings, and religious ceremonies because refusing to do so would signal a level of paranoia that might undermine his authority within the organization. These events were the only times he appeared in public, surrounded by crowds that provided both cover and potential witnesses. Israeli intelligence decided that if they could identify one of these events in advance, they might create an opportunity to eliminate him. But funerals presented enormous operational challenges. They occurred in Hezbollah-controlled neighborhoods where Israeli operatives could not move freely. They were attended by armed fighters who would shoot suspected agents on sight. They were fluid events where Mughniyah might appear briefly and then vanish, making targeting difficult. And they were culturally sacred, meaning that any attack would be witnessed by civilians whose testimony could expose Israeli involvement. Despite these challenges, Caesarea unit began planning for an operation that would use a funeral as cover for assassination. They studied videos of Lebanese funerals, analyzing how processions moved, where security was concentrated, and where gaps existed that operatives could exploit. They recruited assets inside Hezbollah who could provide advance warning when funerals were planned and whether Mughniyah might attend. And they trained operatives in the specific skills needed to infiltrate Lebanese Shiite communities, including language, cultural practices, and religious rituals. The breakthrough came in February 1994, when a Mossad asset inside Hezbollah reported that a senior operative had been killed in fighting near the Israeli border. The operative, a cousin of Hassan Nasrallah who would later become Hezbollah's Secretary General, was important enough that his funeral would attract senior leadership. The asset indicated that Mughniyah would likely attend because the deceased had served under his command, and because refusing to attend would insult Nasrallah, whose support Mughniyah needed as he rose within Hezbollah's hierarchy. The intelligence was passed to Caesarea unit's commander, whose identity remains classified. He reviewed the information and determined that the funeral presented a viable opportunity. 5 operatives could potentially infiltrate the procession, eliminate the target, and escape in the confusion before Hezbollah security realized what had happened. The plan was audacious and carried enormous risks. If the operatives were identified before reaching the target, they would be captured and killed. Hezbollah interrogators were not constrained by the legal limitations that Western intelligence agencies faced. They had extensive experience torturing prisoners to extract information. If the operation failed and operatives were captured, the intelligence damage could be catastrophic. Israeli operational methods would be exposed. Sources inside Hezbollah would be compromised. And the operatives themselves would be paraded on television, providing Hezbollah with a propaganda victory. But the opportunity to eliminate Mughniyah might not come again. His security was improving. His paranoia was deepening. And his operations were becoming more sophisticated, with intelligence suggesting he was planning attacks inside Israel itself. Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin authorized the operation. The decision was made in a secure conference room in Jerusalem, where Rabin, Defense Minister Shimon Peres, and senior Mossad officials reviewed the plan's details. Rabin asked about escape routes, contingency plans if the operation was compromised, and the likelihood of civilian casualties. Caesarea's commander acknowledged the risks but emphasized that Mughniyah's elimination would significantly degrade Hezbollah's operational capabilities and send a message that no one who killed Israelis was beyond reach. Rabin signed the authorization order, adding a handwritten note that the operation should proceed only if field commanders were confident they could extract the operatives successfully. He did not want Israeli agents captured and paraded on television. The authorization was transmitted to Caesarea in a coded message that contained no details of the operation, only confirmation that the Prime Minister had approved it. 5 operatives were selected from Caesarea's most experienced agents. Their names remain classified, protected by Israeli secrecy laws that prevent disclosure of intelligence personnel identities even decades after operations conclude. But intelligence sources describe them as Arabic-speaking Israeli Jews from Middle Eastern backgrounds who could pass as Lebanese in appearance, accent, and cultural behavior. 3 had been born in Iraq before immigrating to Israel as children. 1 was of Yemeni descent. 1 was of Syrian Jewish heritage, his family having fled Damascus in the 1940s. All spoke Arabic as a native language. All understood Shiite religious practices. All had operated in Lebanon before, during Israel's occupation of the south, and understood the risks of working in Hezbollah-controlled territory. They had survived situations where operational security had failed and only quick thinking and cultural knowledge had allowed them to escape. The operatives spent 2 weeks preparing. They studied videos of Lebanese funerals, observing how mourners dressed, how they moved, what prayers they recited, and how processions were organized. They noted that mourners from outside the immediate neighborhood often did not know each other, making it easier for strangers to blend in. They observed that security focused on protecting the procession from external threats like car bombs or snipers, not on screening mourners who joined the crowd. And they identified the moment when processions were most vulnerable, when they entered narrow streets where crowds compressed and movement became chaotic. They rehearsed the operation in a training facility built to replicate Beirut's southern suburbs. The facility, located in the Negev desert, contained full-scale reconstructions of Lebanese streets, with narrow alleyways, concrete buildings, and even laundry hanging from balconies to match the operational environment. Hundreds of role players, including Mizrahi Jews who spoke Arabic, simulated a funeral procession. The operatives practiced moving through crowds without attracting attention, identifying the target amid chaos, executing the kill, and escaping through predetermined routes. They repeated the rehearsal dozens of times, varying conditions to prepare for different scenarios. What if the target appeared late? What if security was heavier than expected? What if the procession took a different route? Each scenario was gamed out, contingency plans developed, escape routes memorized. The weapons selected were suppressed pistols. Specifically, Beretta 92 FS models modified with custom suppressors that reduced muzzle blast and report to barely audible levels. The pistols were loaded with hollow-point ammunition designed to expand on impact, maximizing internal damage while minimizing the risk of bullets passing through the target and hitting bystanders. Each operative carried 2 magazines. 15 rounds per magazine. Enough ammunition to neutralize the target and engage bodyguards if necessary. They also carried small explosive devices. Not bombs designed to kill, but flashbangs that would create noise and confusion without causing casualties. The devices were designed to detonate in alleyways away from the procession, drawing security forces' attention while the operatives escaped in different directions. On the morning of February 16, 1994, the operatives entered Lebanon through the Israeli-controlled security zone in the south. They traveled separately, using forged Lebanese identification documents, and driving cars registered to addresses in southern Lebanon. The documents were perfect replicas, created by Mossad's forgery department using genuine Lebanese ID cards as templates. Israeli military intelligence had coordinated with the South Lebanon Army, a Christian militia force that controlled checkpoints leading to Beirut, ensuring the operatives could pass without being stopped for detailed inspection. The SLA had been armed and funded by Israel for years and operated as a proxy force in southern Lebanon. The funeral was scheduled for 2 p.m. The operatives arrived in the southern suburbs by noon, parking in different locations and making their way on foot to predetermined positions near the mosque where the funeral service would be held. They dressed in dark clothing appropriate for mourning. Black pants, dark shirts, traditional keffiyehs draped over their shoulders. They carried nothing that would identify them as foreign agents. No wallets. No Israeli currency. No documents. Only the forged Lebanese IDs and small amounts of Lebanese pounds. Each operative memorized his role in the operation, his position in the procession, and his escape route. They communicated through brief coded phrases spoken into small radios concealed beneath their clothing, confirming positions and readiness. The radios operated on encrypted frequencies that Hezbollah's security could not monitor without sophisticated equipment. At 1:45 p.m., Hezbollah security forces began arriving at the mosque. Dozens of armed men in civilian clothes established a perimeter, checking identification of anyone who approached and scanning rooftops for threats. The operatives observed from cafes and shops, noting guard positions and identifying gaps in the security cordon where they could slip into the procession. The security was heavy but not impenetrable. Hezbollah expected threats from Israeli airstrikes or car bombs, not from infiltrators on foot blending into crowds. Their security protocols focused on preventing vehicular attacks and protecting against sniper fire from distant buildings. They did not expect assassins to walk into the middle of a funeral procession surrounded by hundreds of witnesses. This was the operational blind spot Mossad intended to exploit. At 2 p.m., the funeral service began inside the mosque. Mourners packed the prayer hall, spilling into the courtyard where loudspeakers broadcast the imam's eulogy. The operatives joined the crowd in the courtyard, kneeling when others knelt, bowing when others bowed, reciting prayers they had memorized phonetically. No one questioned their presence. In a community where funerals were public events attended by hundreds of people, strangers were expected. The imam's eulogy praised the deceased as a martyr who had died fighting Israeli occupation. He spoke of sacrifice, of resistance, of the duty every believer had to defend Lebanese sovereignty against foreign aggression. The crowd responded with chants. Allahu Akbar. God is great. Death to Israel. The operatives chanted along, their voices blending with hundreds of others. At 2:30 p.m., the coffin was carried from the mosque. 6 men hoisted it onto their shoulders while others held flags and photographs of the deceased. The procession formed, stretching back over 100 meters as mourners fell into line. The operatives positioned themselves in the middle of the procession, close enough to reach the target, far enough back that they would not be near the heaviest concentration of bodyguards who typically surrounded senior leaders. Imad Mughniyah appeared 10 minutes after the procession began. He had been inside the mosque but emerged from a side entrance, joining the procession after it was already moving. This was his standard security protocol, never arriving at the beginning of events when security forces might be most alert. Always joining after crowds had formed and attention had shifted to the main activities. He wore dark clothing like other mourners and walked without bodyguards immediately beside him, understanding that obvious security would identify him to surveillance. But he was not alone. 3 men walked near him. Not close enough to appear as bodyguards. Close enough to respond if threats materialized. The operatives recognized him immediately. They had studied his photographs for weeks, memorizing the shape of his face, his walk, his mannerisms. One operative transmitted a brief radio message. Target confirmed. The others acknowledged with double clicks on their transmit buttons, confirming they were in position and ready to execute. The procession moved through streets barely wide enough for the crowd. Buildings pressed close, their facades scarred by bullet holes from decades of conflict. Children watched from windows. Women stood in doorways. Shopkeepers observed from behind metal shutters, paying respects even as they continued their work. The operatives moved with the crowd, chanting prayers, appearing no different from any other mourners. They let the distance between them and Mughniyah close gradually. Not rushing. Not forcing their way forward in ways that might attract attention. Just moving naturally with the flow of the procession. The narrow street where the killing would occur was 3 blocks ahead. The operatives knew the location from their reconnaissance and planning. It was a bottleneck where the procession would slow and compress. Where buildings on both sides created confined space that would limit escape routes for bodyguards. Where the operatives could strike and then disappear into alleyways that led to prepositioned vehicles. At 3:15 p.m., the procession entered the killing ground. The street narrowed to barely 4 meters wide. The crowd compressed, bodies pressed together. Movement slowed as the front of the procession navigated the tight space. The operatives were now less than 10 meters from Mughniyah. Close enough to see his profile. Close enough to observe that he was speaking quietly to a man beside him. Close enough to act. The lead operative transmitted. Execute. 3 operatives drew their weapons simultaneously. The suppressed pistols made soft clicking sounds barely audible over the noise of the crowd. The chanting. The shuffling feet. The ambient noise of a city that never fell completely silent. The first operative fired twice. Both rounds striking Mughniyah in the upper back, punching through clothing and flesh, collapsing his right lung and severing major blood vessels near his spine. The second operative fired 3 times. 2 rounds hit him in the neck, tearing through his carotid artery. 1 struck the base of his skull, fracturing bone and causing catastrophic neurological damage. The third operative engaged a bodyguard who reached for a weapon, putting 2 rounds into his chest before he could draw. Mughniyah fell forward into the people ahead of him. Blood sprayed across their clothing, dark and arterial, pumping from wounds that would prove fatal within seconds. For 3 seconds, no one understood what had happened. The sounds of the shots were too quiet to register as gunfire over the ambient noise. People thought someone had collapsed from heat or grief. Then they saw the blood, the wounds, the weapons in the operatives' hands. Chaos erupted. People screamed. Some ran toward the gunfire, trying to help the fallen. Others ran away, seeking cover from threats they could not identify. The coffin was dropped as its bearers scattered. Bodyguards drew weapons, scanning the crowd for threats, but unable to identify who had fired. The assassins were already mourners again, weapons concealed, moving with the panicked crowd. The operatives moved immediately, pushing through the crowd toward the alleyways they had scouted. They did not run. Running would identify them. Instead, they moved quickly but deliberately, like people seeking safety from danger rather than fleeing from culpability. 2 operatives detonated small explosive devices inside streets. The flashbangs created loud bangs that echoed off buildings, drawing security forces' attention away from their actual escape routes. People screamed, thinking more attacks were coming, that bombs were exploding throughout the neighborhood. Within 60 seconds of the shooting, the operatives had disappeared into the maze of backstreets and alleyways that crisscrossed the southern suburbs. They split up, each heading toward different vehicles parked in locations they had memorized during reconnaissance. Behind them, Hezbollah's security forces were securing the scene, trying to control the crowd, searching for suspects who were no longer there. Imad Mughniyah was dead before medics reached him. 3 bullets had struck vital areas, causing massive trauma that would have been fatal even with immediate surgical intervention. His bodyguards carried his body into a nearby building, refusing to let Lebanese police or ambulance crews approach until Hezbollah's own medical personnel arrived. They knew that Israeli intelligence often tried to confirm successful assassinations through communications intercepts or surveillance of medical responses. They did not want to provide that confirmation. But the truth could not be hidden. Within hours, Hezbollah announced that a senior commander had been killed in a martyrdom operation. Their euphemism for assassination. They did not initially identify Mughniyah by name, understanding that doing so would confirm his death to Israeli intelligence. But word spread through the southern suburbs, through the networks of fighters and supporters who had known him. By evening, Lebanese media were reporting that Imad Mughniyah, one of Hezbollah's most feared operatives, had been killed by unknown gunmen during a funeral procession. The operatives reached the Israeli-controlled zone by 6 p.m., crossing back into Israel through the same checkpoints they had used that morning. They were debriefed immediately at a secure facility near the Lebanese border. Intelligence officers questioned them for hours, recording every detail of the operation. What had they observed? How had security been deployed? Had anyone challenged their presence? Had their weapons functioned correctly? Had the escape routes worked as planned? The operatives provided detailed accounts, identifying what had worked and what had not, assessing whether any operational security had been compromised that might endanger future operations or expose Israeli intelligence methods. Mossad analysts reviewed the reports and concluded that the operation had been a tactical success. All operatives had escaped without injury. No Israeli fingerprints had been left at the scene that could definitively prove Israeli involvement. And the target had been eliminated in the heart of hostile territory, demonstrating that Hezbollah could not protect its leaders even in neighborhoods they controlled absolutely. Champagne was opened at Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv. Officers who had tracked Mughniyah for over a decade celebrated his death as one of the most significant operational victories in the organization's history. Prime Minister Rabin was briefed on the success and sent his congratulations to the operatives and planners who had executed the mission. But something was wrong. Within 24 hours, Hezbollah released photographs of Mughniyah's body at his funeral. The funeral was held quickly, according to Islamic tradition that requires burial within 24 hours of death. Thousands attended, filling the streets of the southern suburbs as senior Hezbollah officials eulogized the man they described as one of the resistance's greatest heroes. The photographs were distributed to media outlets. They showed a body wrapped in the Lebanese flag, surrounded by mourners, being carried through streets lined with thousands of supporters. And when Mossad analysts studied those photographs, comparing them with known images of Mughniyah, they realized something catastrophic. The man in the photographs was not Imad Mughniyah. The facial structure was similar. The build was similar. The age was approximately correct. But detailed biometric analysis, comparing bone structure, ear shape, and other identifying features that cannot be altered, revealed that Mossad had killed the wrong man. The victim was Mustafa Durrani, one of Mughniyah's bodyguards and a senior Hezbollah operative, in his own right. He had been walking beside Mughniyah during the procession, speaking with him, matching his movements so closely that from 10 meters away in a moving crowd, the operatives had mistaken him for the target. Mughniyah himself had been walking several meters away, partially obscured by other mourners. And he had survived. The realization was devastating. Mossad had executed a near-perfect operation. Infiltrating hostile territory. Striking in the middle of a funeral procession. Escaping without casualties. But they had failed to achieve the primary objective because of a targeting error made in the chaos of a moving crowd. The mistake echoed the 1973 Lillehammer disaster, when Mossad operatives had killed an innocent Moroccan waiter after mistaking him for Ali Hassan Salameh, a Palestinian terrorist involved in the Munich Olympics massacre. That operation had been one of Mossad's greatest embarrassments, resulting in the arrest of several operatives and international condemnation. This operation was different because the victim was not an innocent civilian but a Hezbollah operative who had himself been involved in attacks against Israeli and Western targets. But the failure to kill Mughniyah meant that Israel's most wanted terrorist remained alive, now more paranoid and security-conscious than ever. Intelligence reports in the weeks following the assassination attempt indicated that Mughniyah had gone completely underground. He stopped attending any public events, including funerals. He moved constantly between safe houses, never sleeping in the same location twice. He communicated only through couriers he had known for years, people whose loyalty was beyond question. And he began planning revenge operations, determined to strike back at Israel for attempting to kill him. The failed assassination had made him more dangerous, not less. Within Mossad, the operation was classified as a qualified success. Durrani had been a legitimate target whose death degraded Hezbollah's operational capabilities. The operation had demonstrated that Israeli intelligence could strike anywhere, anytime, against anyone. And it had sent a message to Hezbollah's leadership that no one was safe, that funerals and weddings and religious ceremonies could not protect them from Israeli reach. But privately, the operatives and planners who had worked on the mission knew it had been a failure. The man they had been sent to kill was still alive, and the opportunity to eliminate him in similar circumstances would never come again. Mughniyah would live for another 14 years. He continued planning and executing operations against Israeli and Western targets, including the 1994 bombing of a Jewish community center in Buenos Aires that killed 85 people and the 1996 bombing of the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia that killed 19 American servicemen. He expanded Hezbollah's military capabilities, building an arsenal of rockets and missiles that transformed the organization into a regional military power. And he trained a generation of Hezbollah operatives in the tactics and techniques that would make the organization one of the most sophisticated non-state military forces in the world. In 2008, Imad Mughniyah was finally killed. Not in a funeral procession, but in a car bomb in Damascus, Syria, where he had been meeting with Syrian and Iranian intelligence officials. The bomb was planted in the headrest of his vehicle by operatives who had tracked him for months. When he got into the car, sensors detected his presence and detonated the explosive, killing him instantly. Israeli intelligence has never officially confirmed responsibility for the operation. But intelligence sources, speaking on condition of anonymity, have acknowledged that Mossad planned and executed the assassination, using lessons learned from the failed 1994 attempt. This time, they did not rely on visual identification in a crowd. They used electronic tracking, biometric verification, and a weapon system that ensured the target could not survive. The 1994 funeral operation remains classified within Mossad, with many details still restricted decades after it occurred. But the operation has become a case study taught to intelligence officers around the world, not as an example of success, but as a warning about the challenges of targeting operations in hostile environments where identification must be made quickly under stressful conditions. Because even when everything else goes right, when planning is meticulous and operatives are skilled and security is penetrated successfully, operations can still fail if the most critical element is wrong. Identifying the target. The operation demonstrated that intelligence services can exploit cultural rituals that communities trust, turning funerals and weddings into hunting grounds. But it also demonstrated the limits of human intelligence in chaotic environments where targets know they are hunted and take extreme measures to avoid identification. Today, the street in Beirut where the shooting occurred looks much as it did in 1994. The same narrow alleyways. The same concrete buildings scarred by conflict. The same sense of community solidarity that makes these neighborhoods impenetrable to outsiders. But the residents remember. They remember the funeral procession that became a killing ground. They remember the panic when shots rang out and no one knew where the danger was coming from. They remember carrying wounded to hospitals while security forces sealed off streets, searching for assassins who had already vanished. And they remember the lesson Hezbollah learned that day. That Israel could reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. That no gathering was safe. That even sacred rituals could be violated by operatives willing to walk into the heart of enemy territory with no guarantee they would walk out alive. The operation changed how Hezbollah protected its leadership. Security protocols that had focused on preventing car bombs and airstrikes were redesigned to defend against infiltrators and close-range assassinations. Funerals became heavily controlled events where attendance was restricted and mourners were screened. Senior officials stopped appearing in public except under conditions where their presence could be kept secret until after they had left. And the organization invested heavily in counterintelligence, hunting for the sources inside Hezbollah who had provided Israel with information about the funeral. 3 men were eventually identified as suspected collaborators. They were arrested, interrogated, and executed. Whether they were actually the sources who had helped Mossad, or whether they were simply convenient scapegoats, remains unknown. Hezbollah never publicly acknowledged what information they had provided, or how they had been recruited. For Israel, the operation's failure to kill Mughniyah represented a missed opportunity that would haunt intelligence officials for years. They had taken extraordinary risks, penetrated deep into enemy territory, executed a complex operation with precision, and still failed because one man looked too much like another in a crowded street. The margin between success and failure had been measured in meters. If Mughniyah had been walking 3 meters to the left, if the crowd had been slightly less dense, allowing clearer lines of sight, if Durrani had not been speaking with Mughniyah at that exact moment, mimicking his posture and movements, any of these variables, changed by the smallest degree, might have resulted in success. But intelligence operations exist in a world where small margins determine outcomes, where perfect planning can be undone by chance, where operatives can do everything right and still fail because the target moved at the wrong moment, or wore different clothing or chose a different route. The operatives who carried out the mission were never publicly identified. They returned to regular duties within Mossad, their involvement in the operation known only to a small circle of senior officials. Some continued working in Caesarea, participating in other targeted killing operations across the Middle East and Europe. Others retired, taking their knowledge of one of Israel's most daring operations with them into civilian life. None have ever spoken publicly about what happened that day in Beirut. Israeli law prohibits former intelligence officers from disclosing classified information, even decades after operations conclude. The penalties for violation include lengthy prison sentences. But more than legal consequences, there exists within Israel's intelligence community a culture of silence, an understanding that operations remain secret not just to protect current capabilities but to honor the risks taken by operatives who walked into enemy territory knowing they might never return. The families of these operatives do not know what missions their loved ones carried out. Children grow up not knowing that their father infiltrated Hezbollah funerals, or that their mother recruited assets in hostile countries, or that their uncle planned assassinations that changed the course of conflicts. This is the price of working in intelligence. Success must remain secret. Failure must remain secret. And the people who carry out these operations must live with the knowledge that their work, whether successful or not, will never be publicly acknowledged. For Mustafa Durrani, the man killed in Mughniyah's place, his death became a source of pride for his family and community. Hezbollah declared him a martyr, killed defending the resistance against Israeli aggression. His photograph appeared on posters throughout the southern suburbs. His widow received financial support from Hezbollah's social welfare network. His children were educated at Hezbollah schools, raised to honor their father's sacrifice and continue his work. The fact that he had died in place of Mughniyah, that he had inadvertently served as a human shield for one of Hezbollah's most valuable commanders, was never publicly discussed. But within Hezbollah's leadership, it became part of the organization's mythology. Evidence that loyalty and sacrifice were rewarded, that dying in service of the resistance guaranteed honor and remembrance. The operation also had consequences beyond Israel and Lebanon. American intelligence officials, when briefed on the assassination attempt, expressed concern that Israel's willingness to strike in such brazen fashion could trigger escalation that might drag the United States into conflict. The U.S. had its own reasons for wanting Mughniyah dead, given his role in killing hundreds of American servicemen and civilians. But American policy emphasized legal prosecution over assassination, believing that targeted killings created more problems than they solved. The failed attempt reinforced these concerns. It demonstrated that even sophisticated intelligence services could make fatal mistakes when attempting assassinations in hostile environments. It showed that operations designed to eliminate threats could fail in ways that made those threats more dangerous. And it raised questions about whether the tactical benefit of killing individual terrorists justified the strategic risks of conducting operations that violated international law and could trigger broader conflicts. These debates would continue for decades, intensifying after the September 11th attacks when the United States began its own campaign of targeted killings against terrorist leaders using drones and special operations forces. The legal and ethical questions that Israeli operations like the Beirut funeral assassination raised would become central to American counterterrorism policy. Is assassination a legitimate tool of statecraft? Can nations target individuals for death without judicial process? Do the ends of eliminating dangerous terrorists justify the means of violating sovereignty and conducting extrajudicial killings? Israel's answer to these questions has always been pragmatic rather than philosophical. Faced with enemies who seek its destruction and operate from territories where Israeli law does not reach, it has concluded that assassination is sometimes necessary for national survival. The alternative, allowing terrorists to plan and execute attacks without consequence, is unacceptable to a nation that has experienced decades of violence targeting its civilians. But the 1994 funeral operation demonstrated that this calculus involves risks that extend beyond the immediate mission. When operations fail, they can strengthen enemies rather than weaken them. When innocent people die, they can generate sympathy for causes that might otherwise be isolated. And when intelligence services are exposed, they can lose capabilities that took years to develop. These are the calculations that intelligence officials must make. Not in the abstract safety of academic debate, but in the concrete reality of operations where failure means death and success means only that the next operation must be planned. The 5 operatives who walked into that funeral procession understood these stakes. They knew that if they were caught, Israel would likely deny their existence. That their families would be told they died in training accidents or classified operations. That no government would acknowledge their sacrifice or negotiate for their release. This is the nature of covert operations. The people who carry them out exist in a shadow world where traditional rules do not apply, where success is rarely celebrated and failure is never discussed, where the difference between hero and criminal depends entirely on perspective. To Israelis, the operatives who attempted to kill Mughniyah were heroes defending their nation against a terrorist who had murdered hundreds of innocent people. To Lebanese, they were assassins who violated sacred rituals and killed a man during his community's mourning. Both perspectives contain truth. Both perspectives ignore complexity. And both perspectives demonstrate how intelligence operations exist in moral gray zones where clear judgments are impossible. The funeral operation also revealed something about the nature of intelligence work that is often overlooked in popular portrayals. The operation succeeded tactically. Operatives infiltrated hostile territory, penetrated security, eliminated a target, and escaped without casualties. By any conventional measure, it was brilliantly executed. But it failed strategically because the wrong man died. This distinction between tactical success and strategic failure is common in intelligence operations. Missions can go exactly according to plan and still not achieve their intended objectives. Operatives can perform flawlessly and still fail because the intelligence they were given was wrong, or the target changed plans, or the assumptions underlying the operation were incorrect. This is why intelligence agencies spend more time analyzing failures than celebrating successes. Because failures reveal vulnerabilities in planning, gaps in intelligence, or flaws in operational assumptions that must be corrected before the next mission. The Beirut funeral operation's failure led to changes in how Mossad conducted targeted killings. Greater emphasis on biometric identification. More investment in technical surveillance that could track targets electronically rather than relying on visual confirmation in chaotic environments. Development of weapon systems that could verify target identity before striking. These improvements came at enormous cost, both financially and in terms of operational complexity. But they reflected lessons learned from an operation that succeeded in every way except the one that mattered most: killing the right man. Imad Mughniyah would continue to haunt Israeli intelligence for another 14 years. His operations grew more sophisticated. His networks expanded across continents. His relationship with Iranian intelligence deepened, providing Hezbollah with resources that transformed it from a guerrilla movement into a conventional military force capable of fighting Israel's army to a standstill during the 2006 Lebanon War. Each attack he planned reinforced the knowledge that the 1994 funeral operation had been a missed opportunity. That if those operatives had been standing 3 meters to the left, if the crowd had been slightly less dense, if Durrani had not been speaking with Mughniyah at that exact moment, hundreds of lives might have been saved and one of the world's most dangerous terrorists would have been eliminated. But intelligence work does not offer second chances. Operations succeed or fail based on decisions made in seconds under extreme pressure. And the consequences of those decisions ripple forward through years, affecting conflicts that continue long after the operatives who made them have retired or died. The street in Beirut where the shooting occurred has witnessed other violence since 1994. Israeli airstrikes during the 2006 war. Clashes between Hezbollah and rival factions. The spillover from Syria's civil war. But locals still remember the funeral that became an assassination attempt, the day when strangers walked among them with murder in their hearts, and no one realized until blood stained the street. They remember because it taught them that nowhere was safe. That even the most sacred rituals could be violated. That the conflict with Israel was not fought only on battlefields but in their neighborhoods, during their ceremonies, among their families. This understanding has shaped how communities in southern Beirut view security. Every stranger is a potential threat. Every funeral is a potential target. Every gathering requires vigilance that transforms normal life into constant awareness of danger. This is the reality that targeted killings create. Not just the death of individuals, but the transformation of entire communities into spaces of permanent insecurity where trust becomes impossible, and ordinary activities require security measures that would seem paranoid anywhere else. For Israel, this is an acceptable cost of defending national security. For Lebanese communities living under constant surveillance and threat of assassination, it is a form of collective punishment that affects innocent people as much as the terrorists Israel targets. These competing perspectives define the conflict. Neither side sees the other's position as legitimate. Neither side acknowledges the pain its actions cause. And neither side offers a path toward resolution that does not require the other to abandon core principles. The funeral operation encapsulates this deadlock. Israel believed it had the right to eliminate a terrorist who had killed hundreds of its citizens and was planning more attacks. Hezbollah believed it had the right to defend its leaders and retaliate against violations of Lebanese sovereignty. Both positions are internally consistent. Both positions lead to violence. And both positions demonstrate why conflicts driven by intelligence operations and targeted killings are so difficult to resolve. Because every operation, successful or failed, generates grievances that fuel the next cycle of violence. The Beirut funeral operation of 1994 stands as one of the most audacious intelligence missions ever attempted. 5 men walking into the heart of enemy territory, surrounded by armed fighters who would kill them instantly if their identity was discovered, carrying out an assassination in front of hundreds of witnesses, and escaping into streets where every face was hostile and every building could hide an ambush. The operational courage required is difficult to overstate. These were not soldiers advancing with air support and artillery behind them. They were intelligence operatives with nothing but forged documents, suppressed pistols, and the hope that their Arabic was good enough and their cultural knowledge deep enough to pass as Lebanese mourners. One mistake in pronunciation. One wrong gesture. One moment of hesitation when someone asked where they were from or who they knew in the community. Any of these could have exposed them, leading to capture, torture, and execution. Yet they walked into that funeral procession knowing these risks. They positioned themselves meters from their target, surrounded by his bodyguards and supporters. They drew weapons and fired in the middle of a crowd where any one of hundreds of people might have been armed and able to return fire. And they escaped through a neighborhood where Hezbollah controlled every checkpoint and knew every alleyway, where residents would have helped hunt them down if they had understood what was happening. The fact that they succeeded tactically, even while failing strategically, demonstrates capabilities that few intelligence services possess. The ability to operate in denied territory. The skill to blend into hostile populations. The courage to strike when surrounded by enemies. The discipline to escape through chaos without panic. These are the hallmarks of elite intelligence operations, the difference between agencies that can only gather information and agencies that can act on that information in the most dangerous environments on Earth. But the operation's ultimate failure reveals the limits even of elite capabilities. Because intelligence work, at its core, depends on information. And information, especially in the chaos of real-world operations, is always incomplete, always subject to error, always vulnerable to the fog of war that obscures truth and amplifies uncertainty. The operatives had photographs of Mughniyah. They had studied his face, his walk, his mannerisms. They had prepared as thoroughly as anyone could prepare. But in a crowded street, looking at a man's profile from 10 meters away, trying to make a positive identification, while managing stress and adrenaline and the knowledge that they had seconds to act before the opportunity vanished, they made a mistake. A mistake that anyone might make under similar circumstances. A mistake that cost them their primary objective and allowed one of the world's most dangerous terrorists to survive. This is the reality of intelligence operations that popular culture rarely portrays. Success is not guaranteed by preparation or skill or courage. Success depends on 1,000 variables beyond anyone's control, on whether the target moves left instead of right, on whether clouds obscure the moon, on whether a bodyguard happens to walk in front of the target at the critical moment. Intelligence officers plan for these variables. They develop contingencies and backup plans and alternative approaches. But they cannot eliminate uncertainty. They cannot guarantee outcomes. They can only do their best and hope that chance favors their efforts. The 5 operatives who carried out the Beirut funeral operation did their best. They executed a mission that required extraordinary courage and skill. They proved that Israeli intelligence could strike anywhere, against anyone, under any circumstances. But they came home knowing that the man they had been sent to kill was still alive. That their mission, despite its tactical brilliance, had been a strategic failure. That somewhere in Beirut, Imad Mughniyah was already planning his next operation, already identifying new targets, already preparing attacks that would kill more Israelis and Americans than anyone else he considered enemies of Hezbollah. This knowledge would haunt them. Not because they had failed to execute their mission properly, but because they had done everything right and still fallen short. Because in intelligence work, perfection is not enough. You must also be lucky. And on that day in February 1994, luck was not on their side. 14 years later, when Mughniyah finally died in Damascus, killed by a car bomb that Israeli intelligence either confirmed nor denied responsibility for, perhaps those operatives felt a measure of closure. Perhaps they felt satisfaction that the man who had eluded them in Beirut had finally been eliminated. Or perhaps they felt nothing but the cold understanding that intelligence work never ends. That eliminating one terrorist simply creates space for another to rise. That operations considered successful today may prove inadequate tomorrow. That the war they are fighting has no clear victory condition and no defined endpoint. This is what sets intelligence operations apart from conventional military campaigns. Armies can win battles, capture territory, force enemy surrender. Intelligence services can only degrade threats temporarily, knowing that new threats will emerge, requiring new operations, demanding new sacrifices from new operatives who will walk into hostile territory with no guarantee they will return. The Beirut funeral operation demonstrated this reality with brutal clarity. It showed that even the world's best intelligence services operate with incomplete information in chaotic environments where success depends on factors beyond their control. It revealed that targeted killings, while tactically effective, create strategic challenges that persist long after the operation concludes. And it proved that in the shadow war between intelligence services and terrorist organizations, victories are temporary, defeats are instructive, and the conflict continues regardless of individual outcomes. The street in Beirut where Mustafa Durrani died has been repaved multiple times since 1994. The bullet holes in the buildings have been patched. The blood has been washed away by rain and time. But the memory persists. Of the day when a funeral procession became a killing ground. When strangers walked among mourners with murder in their hearts. When Israeli operatives proved they could reach into the heart of Hezbollah's stronghold and strike with impunity. That memory shapes how both sides conduct operations today. How Hezbollah protects its leaders. How Israel plans assassinations. How communities in southern Beirut view strangers and how Israeli intelligence recruits assets willing to provide information about events in hostile territory. The operation failed to kill its target. But it succeeded in demonstrating capabilities that changed how both sides understood the conflict. It showed Hezbollah that nowhere was safe, that no ritual was sacred, that Israeli intelligence would violate any norm to eliminate threats. And it showed Israel the limits of even perfectly executed operations, the importance of accurate intelligence, and the need for capabilities that did not depend on human identification in chaotic environments. These lessons would shape intelligence operations for decades. They would influence how the United States conducted targeted killings after September 11th. They would inform debates about assassination, sovereignty, and the legal boundaries of counterterrorism. And they would remind intelligence professionals that courage and skill, while necessary, are never sufficient. That luck matters. That mistakes happen. That even the best operatives working with the best intelligence can fail when confronted with the chaos of real-world operations. The 5 men who walked into that funeral procession in 1994 understood these truths. They accepted the risks. They executed their mission with precision. And they lived with the knowledge that despite doing everything right, they had killed the wrong man. This is the burden that intelligence operatives carry. Not just the danger of their work, but the weight of operations that succeed tactically while failing strategically. The knowledge that their sacrifices, while real, may not achieve the objectives that justify those sacrifices. In the end, the Beirut funeral operation stands as a testament to both the capabilities and limitations of intelligence work. To the courage of operatives who walk into hostile territory knowing they may never return. To the importance of accurate intelligence in environments where mistakes are fatal. And to the reality that in the shadow war between nations and terrorist organizations, victory is measured not in territory captured or enemies defeated, but in threats degraded and attacks prevented. The operation did not kill Imad Mughniyah in 1994. But it demonstrated that Israeli intelligence possessed the capability, the courage, and the determination to strike anywhere, anytime, against anyone who threatened Israeli citizens. That message, delivered in blood on a Beirut street during a funeral procession, resonated far beyond the immediate operation. It changed how terrorist organizations operated. It influenced how intelligence services planned missions. And it reminded the world that in conflicts without clear battlefields, funerals could become execution chambers, mourners could be assassins, and sacred rituals could be violated by operatives willing to risk everything for their mission. This is the reality of modern intelligence operations. This is the world where shadows have teeth and funeral processions hide death. This is how nations fight wars that are never declared and operations that are never acknowledged. And this is why the story of 5 men who walked into a Beirut funeral in 1994 remains relevant today. Because the challenges they faced, the decisions they made, and the consequences of their actions continue to shape how intelligence services operate in hostile territories around the world. The funeral procession that became a Mossad operation changed everything. It proved that nowhere was safe, that no one was beyond reach, and that in the eternal conflict between intelligence services and those they hunt, even perfect execution cannot guarantee success. If this deep dive into one of history's most daring intelligence operations fascinated you, there's so much more to uncover. The world of covert operations, targeted killings, and shadow wars contains countless stories that never make headlines but shape the world we live in. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our next investigation into the operations that changed history. We're bringing you inside the most classified missions, the most dangerous operations, and the most consequential intelligence failures and successes that governments don't want you to know about. Drop a comment below and tell us what operation you want us to cover next. The Lilyhammer affair? The assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists? The hunt for Carlos the Jackal? Your engagement helps us know what stories matter most to you. And if you found value in this deep dive, smash that like button. It helps the algorithm show this content to others who appreciate real intelligence analysis, not Hollywood fiction. Remember, the stories we cover aren't just history. They're blueprints for understanding how modern intelligence services operate today, in conflicts happening right now, in places you'll never hear about until decades after the operations conclude. This is WarRoom Intel, bringing you the classified stories that shaped our world. Stay informed. Stay critical. And we'll see you in the next operation.